Welcome back, warriors. Tansei Sego Anibuju, Quainin Deluisi Pam Palmater, and I am the host of this show, The Warrior Life. This podcast is a show about living the warrior life, a lifestyle that focuses on decolonizing our minds, bodies, and spirits, while at the same time revitalizing our cultures, traditions, laws, and governing practices. And it's also about asserting, living, and defending our sovereignty all over Turtle Island. And I have to say quite crankily that while we were all enjoying seeing our friends and family again and enjoying getting back to powwows, our summer was rudely, and I might add unnecessarily, interrupted by a federal election. And you know what that means. It means that we have to bring back the one and the only Turtle Island's own political affairs correspondent, Niigaan Sinclair. Yeah, I know. What kind of friend am I to Niigaan that I would interrupt his summer to ask him to come onto the Warrior Life podcast and talk election politics with us? Well, that's how dedicated I am to our listeners, that I would take that risk and ask him to come on here. And for those of you who are new to the planet, Niigaan covers Indigenous issues all over Canada, US, Mexico, and when necessary, in other colonial countries which commit injustices against Indigenous peoples. And he has all the credentials too. Not only was he brought up and grounded in his traditional Anishinaabe culture, but Niigaan is also an associate professor at the University of Manitoba in the Department of Native Studies, and he's a prolific public speaker and media commentator. I literally listen to what he has to say on all of these issues every day. Like we mentioned before, he's an award-winning author and an award-winning columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press. But in order for him to maintain the title of Turtle Island's political affairs correspondent, I think we're going to have to give him a little test first. So what do you have to say about that, Niigaan?
I'm still in shock that you're calling me the only person. Like, I'm just imagining all the people who are now mad.
Oh yeah, no, not the only. So, you're the
so wonderful, but not good when you insult them.
So what do you think? Welcome to the show, by the way.
Bonjour, everybody. Thanks for having me as usual. Good morning from Treaty 1 territory over here. Of course, homeland of my people, the Cree, the Ojibwe, Dakota, Lakota, and then a homeland of the Métis Nation. It's nice to see everyone. We are in the middle of a federal election, whether we want it or not. And I think the fact is that we're in lots of different crossroads, and I'm glad to be here. This is, of course, my job. So this is not something that I'm itching at to do in terms of talking about a federal election, but I'm very happy to be here and very happy to do this with you. I'm so happy, in fact, I'm doing this on a Sunday morning. So there you go.
Oh yeah, I know. See, just even worse. And by the way, also interrupt your weekend. Okay, well, before we get into the election questions, I did say we were going to test you. So we're going to do a speed round of who said this to see if you really know your Canadian politics. Now,
I want you to know that I have a note saying that I have exemptions from testing. So
exemptions from testing.
I'll do the test, but if I fail, then I want you to know that I wasn't supposed to do it in the first place.
Okay. So, we're hoping that you get the name of the person and their political party, but one or the other, that would be good. Okay, are you ready?
Stockwell Day. Okay, did we not start yet? Sorry.
No, okay, here's the first quote. There is no relationship more important to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples.
Okay, Lucien Bouchard, and I think that's a funny political joke.
Yeah.
Obviously, Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. And probably one of the very first things he said as Prime Minister, which literally, the ink wasn't dry on the election, and there he was saying that from the get-go. And I remember when he said that, I turned to my sister beside me because it was at the TRC final report, and I turned to my sister and I said, "Oh my God, the Indian Act's done." And nope, the Indian Act's here.
It was literally his mantra. He said it at every event. It was in all of the mandate letters for all of his ministers. Literally, they had the same thing in all of those mandate letters. So it was like his first 4 years, that was just over and over and over again. There's no relationship more important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wonder what his wife has to say about that. But anyways, okay. All right, here we go.
Yeah. Okay. So the next one's sort of related. Who said this? Trudeau doesn't give a fuck about Indigenous rights.
I did. That was me. I said that.
We're excluded.
No, of course it was Romeo Saganash, and who now is a Winnipeg resident here and working very hard on Leah Kazan's campaign. We see him on the streets. Romeo has become like a quasi-Manitoban right here in Treaty 1 territory. And, great respect for Romeo. Let's all remember that, the only reason that the Liberals are passing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the implementing Bill C-15, is because it's basically Romeo's bill. So let's all just be aware that Romeo was the one who really should be getting credit. But of course, now that he's not in politics or he's in the NDP, the Liberals just kind of forget about that stuff. So.
Right. Okay. Well, now you're 2 for 2. You've got the names and the parties both. Okay. This one.
Anxiety. Okay.
This one, we're going a little bit back in history. Who said this? We also have no history of colonialism in Canada.
John A. Macdonald. That was John A. Macdonald, who said, I believe he believed that with every ounce of his heart.
His premonition, though. We won't have any
person. The reincarnation of him was Stephen Harper.
Yes, exactly. Oh, and what party was he from again?
That was the, I'm going to say 3 options. The Reform / United Conservative / Canadian Line / Conservative Party. So all of them, because they're just all basically the same thing.
Okay, that's awesome. 3 for 3. All right, this one is way back in history. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada.
See, that's a tricky one, actually, because... okay, so say it again.
Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada. And so help me if you're using your phone. By the way, you can't use your phone. And there's no phone a friend.
The single Indian in Canada, I mean, obviously Sir John A is the one that kind of, the reason why I'm struggling is I'm like, is that a Duncan Campbell Scott thing? Like, I
one of 2 dudes.
Yeah, I'm going to say Sir John A, of course, because I think that's more likely. Am I wrong? Duncan Campbell Scott. See, if it's Duncan Campbell Scott, you have to realize that, like, that's, I mean, you have to dig in the archives for that one because, like, he doesn't get to be the front person. He's the back person working hard to make sure that we all have terrible lives. So I take it back. I said Duncan Campbell Scott.
Okay, good. And I mean, Sir John A said iterations of the same thing in many different ways. So it's kind of, but I always get those 2 mixed up.
And for the record, if I say both their names, then they both count. So there you go. It's like the postmodern answering. Oh,
okay. All right. Okay. Here's the next one. And this one is also going back in time, but not that far. First Nation, so he was referencing First Nations treaty chiefs. And he said, these people are threats to national security.
Oh, God.
But you can also pick the party too, and you're good on if you just get the party. Like, what party would say we're threats to national security?
I'm going to say Jason Kenney, but I mean the critical infrastructure bill. But I mean, you could say that's Robert Bourassa.
This is true. Okay, you know what? There should be like multiple answers for this because I didn't give you the whole contextual quote of like it was 3 lines.
Oh, I feel like I'm failing you and you're trying to give me excuses to give me half points.
No. So it was former Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, Bernard Valcourt.
Oh.
And he was testing. Yeah. Remember when the
if you had said who had crashed on a motorcycle and then therefore later said the national that were threats to national security, I'd be like Valcourt for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, Valcourt. And then came Bill C-51 to try to surveil us all legally.
Who was the only person when they called for the National Inquiry into Murder of Indigenous Women and Girls to not stand up.
Oh my gosh! Yes, he was in the front row. How embarrassing! Okay.
Literally, and Tom Mulcair was famously beside him, and he was like, "Oh my, like what is wrong with you?"
That was so iconic. What an ass. Pardon my language. Okay, so that one was a tricky one.
But
and
I think
know that one.
I should get half points for Jason Kenney. Okay, come on.
Because he had said those things too. Yeah, Jason Kenney for sure. And in fact,
he just passed a law for this exact sentiment, who then has been copied by Brian Pallister and been copied by now Aaron O'Toole in the Conservative Party platform. It's the exact same law.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, you could have just said conservatives general and it would have captured all those dudes. So we're good. Okay, here's the last one. And it might be tricky because I don't know if you follow this dude. He's a bit out there. So that's kind of a hint, like a bit out there. He said,
Brad Wall. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Trudeau's extreme multiculturalism and cult of diversity will divide us into little tribes.
I feel like that sounds like a Maxime Bernier.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay.
And do you know his party?
The People's Party or something like that.
Yes, exactly.
The CPC, the Canada People's Party, I think, isn't it?
People's
we might
Party.
call it the anti-vaccination party now.
The anti-vaxxers. Yeah, I know. Exactly.
And most importantly, arrested in southern Manitoba. Like, you got to work hard to be a white guy saying hateful things and still be arrested in southern Manitoba.
Oh my God. In a protest of like 3 people. I mean,
like, there's a lot of racism in southern Manitoba. If you're white, you're pretty privileged down there. The cops are not looking for you. You got to do something pretty rough. And then on top of that, he's led an anti-vaccination, which is the center of anti-vaccination in Manitoba, and he was still arrested. That's pretty impressive.
It's phenomenal.
He was in town the other day facing his court charges. So there.
Oh my gosh, it's just I don't know. It feels so wrongly satisfying. Okay, so let's get to the really hard questions. The first one is, why on earth are we having...
My typical grade was in school was like a C+, a B, so I feel like I got a C+ at least in that. So.
Oh, I'm giving you an A on that one.
Oh,
you really only missed part of one.
I don't need pity grades, but okay, thank you.
I'm a good prof. Come on. Okay. You get an A. Okay, why are we having this election? Hello, it's summertime.
Okay, well, it's pretty basic, and this is a referendum on Trudeau's government, and Trudeau basically sees the writing on the wall, and the writing on the wall is that there's a potential majority in play because he can make inroads in 2 major places. The first is Quebec, because there's a fundamental loss in Bloc support because of a number of reasons, but I think for the most part, people didn't like how the Quebec government handled the pandemic, and they were under lockdown for such a long period of time. And so there's a potential there for Trudeau to break into Quebec and to have an opportunity there. That alone might spark a federal election because the Liberals haven't performed very well there, and certainly they're within majority reach, but they need to have Quebec to do that. The second is this very weakened Conservative Party, which, if you were to ask an everyday Canadian and say, who is the opposition leader, most people would say Jason Kenney or the Canadian premiers instead of Aaron O'Toole. And so there's an opportunity there to see a weakened Conservative Party, and particularly weakened in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. There's a reason why, for example, that the 2 major announcements in this election campaign from the Liberals, the very first one, which was on the day before the writ was dropped, or the Friday before, which was the childcare announcement in Saskatchewan. That was a breakthrough for the Liberals. And then second is that the issues around Indigenous the Indigenous issues in relation to the campaign, Trudeau's been, wants to put that at the forefront, and it was here as recently as last Friday. And so he sees possibilities in the prairies, which the Liberals haven't seen for quite a while. And that's why we're having an election, because the Liberals want a majority, and they want to be able to express and push their agenda forward without the assistance of the NDP. But the fact is that in terms of Indigenous peoples, which are the ones that we're most interested in often writing or thinking, and of course, that there are peoples, this is the probably the most successful Canadian legislature for Indigenous peoples in history. Good, bad, great, ugly. Whether you would like the bills that have been passed for Indigenous languages, child welfare, even the United Nations Declaration C-15 we talked about earlier, that's because of the role of the NDP in able to push the Liberals towards an agenda that isn't just resource-based, but is based in looking towards, trying to deal with some of the major issues that are really breaking down the relationship, which is the issue of the non-recognition of Indigenous rights, Indigenous land claims, adequate consultation. And the fact is that we can't just continue to treat Indigenous peoples like mines to be exploited and be taken things from. And so the Liberals have shown in the past that they're interested in that. They have also shown that they have failed to deliver on their major promise, which is around boil water advisories. So I don't think the Liberals are to be trusted. And the current situation is probably more favorable to Indigenous peoples than it would be for Liberals to have a majority.
Okay, well, that explains a lot, because here we are, still in this pandemic, this fourth wave's coming, summer. I mean, hello, summer. And, we're in an election, which...
It is the positive work that the Liberals have done during the pandemic, which is generally favorable by Canadians. Yeah. Also, by the way, I would say favorable for most Indigenous nations who saw that the Liberals prioritized, and rightfully prioritized. Anybody who had any sense in their head should prioritize First Nations. In terms of the vaccine response, because we know that the vaccine will spread quicker, will damage more, will kill more on First Nations than it will be in Winnipeg or Calgary or Toronto. And so, so for good, bad, great, ugly, Canadians feel generally favorable of Trudeau's reaction to the pandemic. And that's really what's driving this federal election, because the upswing in support, if you look at all of the things the Liberals have really done over the past 3 years, most of them have been major faux pas. There's SNC at Lavalin. There's the We campaign. There's all the issues around the various scandals involving sexual harassment within the military. The Liberals have bungled so many different events. They should be failing in support, but they're getting support because of the pandemic.
Right. And we know, like, if you just look at it the other way, let's pretend that the Harper government was still in power, or it was an Aaron O'Toole government. We wouldn't have seen half the amount of pandemic supports for Canadians in general or Indigenous peoples. And I think that would have made a significant crisis even worse had it been under this, no more bailouts, no more subsidies, work only programs kind of mantra of the Conservatives.
You lost me when you said Aaron O'Toole government. I just my brain exploded, started
apologies
my ear, because I went like, that would never happen. First off, Aaron O'Toole is the most progressive conservative in history. I mean, the guy supports LGBTQ rights. He supports issues around multiculturalism and inclusion. Like it's just a weird state that the Conservatives are in that they're trying to move towards the center, but the very foundation of the party is anti-LGBTQ rights, anti-immigration, anti-Indigenous people. Like, the fact is that you've got this weird situation where the leader of the Conservative Party doesn't really represent who Conservatives, for the most part, are. Certainly a loud vocal large vocal amount of Conservatives. I don't want to say majority, because it really isn't a majority. I think most Conservatives tend to be kind of bouncing between the Liberals and the Conservatives, and so meaning slightly socially aware. And so like, certainly, the idea of Aaron O'Toole being a prime minister is frankly impossible in the current circumstance. His own party won't support him, never mind people in the middle.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that's a good segue into what the polls are saying about these parties. Like, who's even registering as having some kind of national support, and do you think if it's any kind of real contest between the Liberals and the Conservatives?
No, the only question of this campaign is, will the Liberals get into Quebec? Will the NDP moving across the prairies be able to withstand a Liberal majority? Those are the only two questions of this campaign. And the Conservatives, will they hold on to major strongholds, which is Alberta? Will they hold on to Saskatchewan? Will they maintain their support in rural Ontario? Like, that's really the only questions of this campaign, because the fact is that I think this is the last we're going to see of Aaron O'Toole unless there's some major turnaround. I mean, he performed pretty good the first week. So maybe there's, like, just like the T-shirt on the front of the Conservative campaign thing, we all went, oh, Aaron O'Toole looks pretty good in a T-shirt. Like, we may be surprised by Aaron O'Toole, and I think the first week is somewhat surprising. He succeeded in this. The number one thing that the Conservatives want is for Canadians to talk about Conservatives. And they did. They successfully put out their platform. Everybody went, what the hell is this thing? And good, bad. Some people said it's good. Some people said it's bad. I think it's generally very bad for Indigenous peoples for the most part, even though it is the most interested and engaged Canadian Conservative platform in history when it comes to Indigenous peoples, and says things like we should recognize Indigenous rights, but then, like, at the same time says, yeah, but we should arrest them when they go and stand up.
Exactly.
Doesn't make any sense at all. I wrote about that on my column on Saturday. Yeah. But like the fact is that this is an election really about the Liberals, and will Canadians give the Liberals a majority in Quebec? Will they push them over the edge in Quebec? And really, Jagmeet Singh's performance, the fact that he's opened up his campaign trail in Alberta, like, what's that about? That just shows you that the failing support for Jason Kenney and the rise of Rachel Notley has resulted in Jagmeet Singh walking around Calgary in the first week of the campaign. Like who would have predicted that? Yeah. That just tells you that. But if you look at the polls, there's been a 5% drop in Alberta for the Conservatives and a 5% increase for the federal NDP. Jagmeet Singh is the most popular federal leader in Alberta by far. Wow. And so the fact is that will the Liberals be able to hold off the NDP in their support? That's the real question. Those are the two major questions. And I guess the third question is will Aaron O'Toole be able to hold on to the Conservative strongholds long enough to maintain his role as leader? I'm thinking not so much from what I'm seeing.
Okay, well, there's a question that I think about 5 Canadians would be really interested in hearing your response to. But first, I need to show you this little video. There's about 5 people who are very concerned about this. So for those of you who are listening on podcasts and not seeing on video, that was one of my TikToks where the infamous TikToker Native Dad is laughing in the background, and there's pictures of basically Maxime Bernier, leader of the People's Party of Canada, finding out essentially that he won't be able to participate in the federal leaders debate. And he is calling this essentially the work of the political cartel. So what are your thoughts on poor Maxime being booted out of the federal leaders debate?
I've already, just from this podcast alone, thought more about Maxime Bernier than I've ever thought before.
Yeah.
Because I just don't think about him. And the one thing I was interesting in that little TikTok video you showed, it did show him being arrested in southern Manitoba. So right. That's probably the most press that he's gotten in the past 2 years. Yeah. And it's because during the pandemic, when all of us were in lockdown here in Manitoba, he showed up to do a rally, and then the police immediately arrested him for inciting a large group function. And he was arrested for that, and he still is facing charges in southern Manitoba. Like, the fact is, Maxime Bernier has never had a party. It's been an illusion from the beginning. And the idea that he was able to sign up people to sign, like, I can get people to sign up for, if I said free ice cream cones, I could probably get 500 people to sign up for something in an hour. Like, that's Maxime Bernier. If I said, okay, everybody, you can run for office, you're going to get 500 people to sign up for that. That doesn't mean they're candidates. That doesn't mean they're credible candidates. In fact, the fact that I remember we had this discussion in the media newsroom at the Free Press, and we said, oh, well, we found out that one of the Canadian People's Party candidates has said racist things. Should we run a story on it? And the question is like, what would be the point of it? Because we know that they're never going to be elected. We know that they're not a credible political party candidate. We know that they've never been vetted. This has never been a legitimate party. All this proves to you is that there is a measure of racism, of xenophobia, of stupidity and ignorance in this country, and it is in the upper echelons of political power, that Canadians still have those positions, and those can still get you. You can still be a privileged white man and get to the most highest offices of the land, almost become the leader of one of Canada's political parties, like by a hair. Like the guy almost got, Andrew Scheer, almost beat Andrew Scheer. But it tells you that you can be to the highest offices in this land and still be a racist, still be xenophobic, still be so profoundly incorrect and ignorant on virtually every major issue. You could never read anything and still get to the echelons of power in this country. That is probably the only thing that we need to say about Maxime Bernier.
Yeah, and bye-bye. Bye-bye now.
Well, I mean, the question is like, why are we talking about somebody who is like, why does he get a position in supposed civil debate in a federal election? Well, it's because there's two things there. One is the movement of Canadians to try to be inclusive, meaning to support racism as a legitimate form of dialogue, which it isn't.
No.
And so we should probably think about our values as a society when we say, okay, racism is not a civil form of dialogue. And the second is that you can do almost anything, spout hate, and still get 3% of support of the country. That shouldn't get you, just because you can promote hate means that you shouldn't get a position in a major form of dialogue. And frankly, it's embarrassing that the media would humor that.
Yeah, exactly. I've written this article for The Breach. It's going to come out either sometime today or tomorrow. So it'll already be out by the time this podcast is out, probably, where I actually did the painful job of looking through Maxime Bernier's platform and comparing it directly line by line with the Conservative platform. And in fact, they're almost identical on all the things they care about, like making sure pipelines go through, stopping protesters, protecting the right of free speech so that there can't be any hate crime legislation, reducing immigration, stopping bogus asylum claims and refugees. So there's a real, although he's his own, whatever that weird party is, he is a product of the Conservative government. And there's many people in the Conservatives party, that actually share those views. They're just less in your face protesting about it.
I went to South Africa in 1994. Well, 1983 is actually when I was there, but 1993, 94. So I got to watch the Mandela election when I was 17. And it was probably the most remarkable experience of democracy that I ever had anyways, because what you saw people, Africans, literally from South Africa, who had experienced apartheid, and many of them had never voted before. So many people couldn't read because there was no schools for people, who were Africans in South Africa. Of course, that's what racism does, right? Anyways, so there was this really interesting trend that happened in the election. So they had 23 political parties running for office, including Nelson Mandela, of course. And everybody knew Nelson Mandela was going to win. And the second place party was a party called the Inkatha Freedom Party, which was the Zulus, the other tribal community other than the Xhosas, which is what Mandela is. That's his tribe. Anyways, so because people couldn't read, and because people were so profoundly illiterate, they couldn't. They had to go by basically the pictures of what the candidates look like. And because it was what we call a proportional ballot, you've only voted for the party. You didn't vote for candidates. Once the party got in, then they got to pick who the candidates were across the country. It's a different form of democracy. But anyways, so what the opposition parties did, there's 23 political parties, and what they did was they knew that Mandela was gonna win. So what lots of people did is they registered names like the African Men's Council, the AMC, and they would find the guy that most likely looked like Nelson Mandela, and they put him on the ballot so that people, when they got to the ballot and they got this ballot and they can't read, they would go like, okay, what does it look like? I'm looking for something that looks like ANC, and I'm looking for something that looked like Nelson Mandela, and I just put my X beside that. And those parties who were basically a bunch of yahoos who were basically trying their best to get some kind of form of role in the government, because you only had to get 3% of the national vote to then put candidates into the national government. And they did it. They got a percentage of support that they were able to put people in the government, very minor, ineffectual, rather irrelevant people. But that shows you that in any democracy, there is a level of absolutely illegitimate, irrelevant, and pointless views that will never enter into power, that are almost, why would you support such hate or such confusion or frank ignorance? Mm-hmm. And that reminds me, when you talk about Maxime Bernier, of my experience in South Africa.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, let's get to what we know. We know right now the Conservatives, their platform is online. The NDP's platform is online. We don't have a platform for the Liberals, unless I didn't check this morning, but there wasn't yesterday. They said they were going to wait closer to potentially the debates. Any idea why the Liberals wouldn't have their platform up right now like the rest of them?
Because they don't need to. They've got a track record that they can debate on, and frankly, the Liberals, like, why would they put something out that people can attack? The job of the Liberals is to keep the ship steady and to keep it moving. Run on your record. Try to avoid the major minefields, which are SNC-Lavalin. By the way, Jody Wilson-Raybould isn't running, so they don't have to worry about that issue as much anymore. Don't ride on the issues around the We campaign. Notice that Pierre Poilievre and other Conservatives are trying to bring up the issues of the We campaign. And then, of course, most recently, the issues around the harassment in the military and other things that the Liberals have slipped up upon and made major mistakes upon. Just try to avoid those issues the best that you can, because as soon as you put out a party platform, then you have a track record to compare it to. And so what'll happen is that you say, okay, well, we're going to fix boil water advisories, right? Let's say that's on First Nations. Well, the first question would be, didn't you promise that already? And why didn't you deliver on the first 5 years in office? So as soon as you put out a party platform, you say that basically it's a statement of things to say that you haven't done. So of course you don't put out a party platform. It shouldn't be surprising. And what you should be, they're probably going to be releasing it only when they have to, which is when Trudeau is going to face it in a debate. So probably the day before, something to give the Conservatives the most minimal time possible to read it and to pick apart and so on, and for Canadians to be aware of it as well. So it'll be released much later, frankly, if at all, because it may just be parsed out over a number of other documents. That if I were in the Liberal strategy room, I would say your best job is for Canadians to only think about you who already support you, and to give people reasons to support you in certain strategic areas of the country, like the child care plan, like the issues around the pandemic response. Keep talking about the economic recovery, because that will get you into Alberta. I think that would be generally, if I was in the Liberal strategy room, that's what I would be saying. Unfortunately, Indigenous peoples lose on that issue because the Liberals have been so porous on it. They have really, poverty has increased, as an example. The only thing the Liberals have done to solve poverty is they've moved the market basket measure, which is the way that we assess poverty, which is basically the price of a basket of goods. What they've done is they've said, oh, well, it's less than we thought, so therefore 150,000 people overnight were classified and defined as being out of poverty, where nothing had been invested. They just defined it differently. And so that's what the Liberals have done with poverty. And guess who's the ones in poverty? That's us. That's our people. And so, the fact is that the Liberals have really failed on issues involving Indigenous peoples. For the most part, they have given little things like the Indigenous Languages Act. By the way, that act will never save any Indigenous languages. It's mostly like an after-school program. It'll fund. That's about it. And then the child welfare bill, which has had very mixed results. I would say generally First Nations are happy about it, but they aren't happy that they haven't had any funding attached to it, because the provinces still grip with their cold dead hand every penny in Indigenous child welfare. And so they refuse to give it up. So there's no new money there. So every single time so First Nations have control over your child welfare, but they don't have any funding for it. So that means that it's like the same broken model that First Nations are now delivering. And that's the problem here, is that most of the things the Liberals have provided over their time in office have been pretty pretty status quo, pretty much continuing the same thing the Conservatives were doing and so on. And not much has changed for the everyday life of an Indigenous person in this country, except for maybe the Métis. The Métis are quite pleased that the Liberals are in office because the Liberals are the very first people to recognize them as a nation, to compensate them for historical wrongs. And frankly, you know, the Métis are very pleased for the Liberals to continue into office. And we see that with, you know, David Chartrand being one of the most Indigenous friendly leaders in the country, alongside other First Nations leaders who are in Manitoba here, probably some of the most friendly Liberal leaders, people like Arlen Dumas and people like you know, Cindy Woodhouse, who's the AFN Manitoba regional chief, people like Garrison Settee. You know, they even posed for a selfie on Friday with him. The fact is that, you know, First Nations leaders and Indigenous leaders here in Manitoba tend to be more liberal leaning because they are getting a great deal of regional support for their initiatives.
Well, and keep in mind for all the listeners or viewers that Niigaan's been writing about these things too in the Winnipeg Free Press. So in addition to being in, you know, on the TV commentary, you can actually read his articles where he, you know, he just wrote an article about this. Okay, so let me ask you, of the three parties, are there things that you like from the Liberals, Conservatives, and NDP? Like anything specific that you think is good?
Oh yeah, I've already said before that this Conservative Party is the most engaged in Indigenous issues in history. Like I've said before, this is the most progressive Conservative leader in history, in Aaron O'Toole. He still says radically inappropriate, incorrect, factually wrong, and borderline racist things. Like he says that residential schools were positive. He says things like Indigenous peoples are nothing but, you know, problem creators or borderline terrorists. You know, like so there are like major problems with Aaron O'Toole that are the same old Conservative politics of the past. But there is some movement, I think, in the Conservative Party to certainly try to move towards the center, try to move towards the ways in which everyday Canadians might consider them as an option. And frankly, you just didn't see that under Andrew Scheer or Stephen Harper, where they were very quite satisfied to try to, you know, live off that bedrock of Canadian support that hates people from other nations of the world and their headwear and their culture and their religion, and frankly Indigenous peoples as well. And so the Conservative Party is just interesting. It's interesting to watch right now, and to see some of the movement. I certainly don't want a Conservative Party that continues to hate and, you know, call Indigenous peoples terrorists and try to pass legislation that continues Jason Kenney's legacy, which is that anytime you stand in front of any, do your legally obtained right to stand in front of development on your territories, that somehow you'll be arrested without any court injunction or any involvement of Canadians. You know, the fact is that there is a great deal of racism within that party, that it's very hard to see the good things. And they have passed some good things in their policy platform, saying namely that they're going to recognize Indigenous rights, but like completely undermined when it comes to passing other parts of their policy. The NDP, of course, it's like trying to talk about the party that you know will never form government. And so they can offer everything under the sun. They can make they can say, oh, we're going to hand back all the stolen land. Well, until you're in office, I don't know what that's going to look like. So you can promise everything under the sun all day. And the NDP does promise really important, beautiful things, like saying things like, we're going to cure child poverty. We're going to make restorative justice one of the plans of dealing with federal prisons, so we don't have continually send Indigenous young people to prison. So the NDP promises big, but they can do so because you're never going to form government. So of course, the Liberals have a track record that there are some good things, some good elements within it. But of course, the Liberals, I think, are not to be trusted when they are on their own. How do we know that? Well, when Liberals were on their office the first time around, they bought a pipeline. They passed, put forward a murder missing Indigenous women and girls inquiry, but then failed to really listen and carry through on many of the implementation of that calls from that inquiry. Never mind the fact that that inquiry really didn't go forward with the support. It didn't go forward with the support of families and Indigenous peoples who are most affected by the issue. So, the fact is that Liberals on their own don't do well for our communities. They do much better when they have the NDP in their ear and they need the NDP support. So I think this parliament, this minority parliament, is quite successful for Indigenous people, much so than I think a Liberal majority will look like.
Okay, so, that being said, here's some of the pros of each of them, one of which won't form a party or won't form the government. What's some of the worst parts of the platforms? Is there anything that you've looked at that you thought, this is, you've kind of talked about the conservative, anti-protester rhetoric and so-called securing Canada's infrastructure, I guess. But are there any other things from any three of those parties that are an actual concern?
Yeah, the Conservatives have the same, you can almost write this, and I could have predicted this before you saw, the Conservative platform is all about resource development, and it's all about encouraging First Nations. So they have 6 pages in their 140-page policy document about First Nations, Indigenous peoples. And of course, the Métis, not mentioned at all, not engaged with, not interested with, because I think in many Conservative circles, the Métis aren't an Indigenous government, aren't legitimate. And so the Métis just aren't part of that conversation. But so for the Métis, for the Conservative Party, the Conservative Party is really just interested in Indigenous lands and resources, period. That's it. But then there's these weird parts of their platform where they say, we want to support Indigenous land-based learning for addictions programs. Do we realize that you can't have land-based programs for addictions if there's no land? It doesn't make any sense. So okay, if you're going to be okay, hey, First Nation, we want you to make this pipeline or mine or hydro project on your territory, but we also want you to have this addictions program that's land-based. Oh, you have no land left? Oh,
darn it.
Oh, well, I guess that other promise not so important. What's more important is you have a job. Oh, you have a job where you can't breathe the air? Oh, well. It's what? Or you feel completely terrible about yourself because you have no bears, because you can't sing your bear songs because there's no bears left. So now you're going to cope with that with alcohol and you see the point here?
Yeah.
There's no point in saying a land-based program to deal with addictions because you're just increasing the addiction with the other parts of your program, or the sense of apathy or the sense of shame, or all those kinds of things. So the policy is just status quo conservatism with a few progressive elements. So it's but it makes these progressive elements look really like sort of Jekyll and Hyde. It's this weird, why? You're over here, but then that if you think about it, you can't really offer this and offer this at the same time. Anyways, so what are the worst parts of the NDP? The worst parts of the NDP campaign, I think, is that there's some coziness, I think, with Jagmeet Singh and that same agenda of resource development, because they really want to get into Alberta. And they know that to get into Alberta, you're going to need to be a pro-resource agenda, which will necessarily always stomp on Indigenous rights. So there's this kind of complicated relationship, I think, that the NDP has with their own caucus, because they have very strong Indigenous peoples within their caucus, people like Leah Gazan, who have said that we are a party that will bring Indigenous rights into the forefront and make sure that it's involved in consultation. Well, unfortunately, you won't get power in Alberta if you say that Indigenous rights will be part of your agenda, unless there's some massive change in attitude in Alberta, which isn't coming probably in our lifetime. And so, or maybe with the environment, maybe with the issues around the environment, that may be the wedge issue where the NDP have a real foot put forward. Because, Anna May Paul and the Green Party, which is the first time we're talking about, isn't it interesting that the environment should be the most important issue of this election, and the Green Party can't leave Toronto. They're still stuck in this civil war in their own party in Toronto. The Green Party we may be watching the Green Party marching itself into oblivion. all that work that Elizabeth May did, and whatever you feel about Elizabeth May, good, bad, great, ugly, the fact is that the Green Party is marching into oblivion right now, and self-imposed, just watching. And it really has to do with Toronto Greens and then rural Greens. And the fact is that many rural Greens are quite conservative, and that urban Toronto Greens tend to be very progressive. And when it comes to the environment, you can bridge both those communities. But when it comes to Israel, you cannot. And so it's this weird kind of thing that the Green Party is going through of they don't really inhabit a political space on the traditional spectrum. So like, what do you do there? And so that's where the Green Party is. But unfortunately, who loses out is the environment. The environment is really the lost part of the conversation in this election. No one's talking about it. No one's talking about the carbon tax. I don't even think anybody said the carbon tax in the first week of the election campaign. That is probably the biggest loss to all Canadians. And who is winning in that regard? Well, it's the Liberals, because the Liberals want people to talk about the environment less, because they want to be able to say that they are the leaders on the environment, that they're the ones putting forward the carbon tax. They really don't want to touch the carbon tax, because that means they'll lose the support in the prairies particularly, because people then will have to pay 3 more pennies at the per liter at the gas station. So they know that they don't want the environment to be the issue, even though it should be one of the major issues. Because frankly, I'm in Manitoba. I watch the world burning every day in the north. The North wildfires. We've experienced a massive drought this year, an incredible destruction of our environment, and the water is the lowest in history. And then on top of this, it's very likely that we're going to be experiencing big food shortages because of the issues around the drought that's happened, and the fact that the earth is scorched, and therefore, for farmers who are trying to grow grain, it's going to be very difficult and hard when fire and wildfires or the issue of burning is how you reproduce the earth, but it's already burnt.
So, all of that said, we're going to see the English language and the French language debate on September 8th and 9th. How important do you think that these debates are? Do you think that, you can win or lose based on a debate, or is it more the platform?
Well, this debate will be interesting because for the very first time in history, you'll see an APTN. I believe it's Todd Labyrinth. I think who will be? Do you know who it is?
Isn't it Melissa?
Oh, is it Melissa? Okay, I didn't know. I didn't know who it is, but if it's Melissa, if it's Todd, if whoever it is,
I'm not sure, but APTN.
So APTN has a role in this federal debate, and that's interesting. I mean, that's a real step for the APTN, because the goal of APTN was always to become the other national broadcaster, like CBC, CTV, Global, and now APTN. And really, I think this is the very first time in history you'll see APTN as taking that spot as the, playing with the other big kids in the field, sort of thing. Anyways, so that's good for them. But debates are really there for the decided.
Yeah.
Debates are not for the undecided. If you are an undecided and you're watching a debate, you're not making a decision during the debate. What you're doing is you tend to watch those who are decided around you decide whether they're going to for sure vote for their person or not, because we don't tend to vote for, we tend to vote against, right? And so people are like watching Justin Trudeau and they already hate Justin Trudeau. And so if you are an undecided person sitting with a decided person about Justin Trudeau, you're trying to figure out like how much do they hate Justin Trudeau. And so you're watching to see how he screws up, and you're watching to see what is he saying that makes you push to like him less. And therefore then you're going to vote for Aaron O'Toole because you like Justin Trudeau less. That's the thing about debates people don't often understand. And when you look at the polling of debates, when people go in and out, undecideds only decide on who they're going to vote for by the mistakes that leaders make, not by the things they happily promise. I would like to think that people vote on their the positive side, but they don't. That happens actually during policy announcements. So when people say, I'm going to invest in childcare, so you'll get more votes from that for your party than you would during a debate, when you tend to get votes if you didn't screw up. So that's what most oftentimes debates are. Debates are there to kind of solidify the support of people who are already supporting you, and to make sure you don't make a major faux pas, that you keep your party platform, you attack instead of react during those debates more than anything else.
Okay, so, let's move away from debates and really talk about the Indigenous vote. So when Trudeau got in the first time, it was actually, as you talked about in the media, a historic number of Indigenous peoples voted, many who were voting for the first time, and there was a huge amount of support for Trudeau. Second time around, there was less Indigenous voters, and you've got Trudeau with a minority government. This time around, how involved do you think Indigenous peoples will be? Do we think that it'll still be a lower number than it was during that historic vote? Do you think that there's more interest now that more Indigenous peoples will vote, or does summer impact all of this?
The main difference between the 2015 and 2019 vote was the boogeyman of Stephen Harper.
Mm-hmm.
So people were not voting for Trudeau for the most part. Like I think about some people that I know and here in Manitoba who are just staunch Liberal supporters, have always been Liberal supporters, have always voted Liberal. These are First Nations, Inuit people, Indigenous people, Métis people. So, I mean, they're going to support them no matter what. And those are people also, by the way, who I think sometimes are very happy with the status quo that Canadian politics offer to them. And good, bad, great, ugly, those are people in major power positions within Manitoba. So I'm not here to criticize them, but I would say that problem ultimately is there's no party that supports Indigenous peoples, that will support Indigenous rights, that will hand the land back. So let's just, the fact is that the reason why people voted less in 2019 is a mixture of apathy surrounding the Liberals. They couldn't maintain the support that they got in 2015. And there was no evil boogeyman, Stephen Harper, to inspire people to go out and vote, because things had gotten so bad. We had never had a leadership meeting, for example, that involved Indigenous leaders and the Prime Minister. We had never had anything other than very aggressive resource agendas, and then a stupid Education Act that was a waste of time. That was called First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act or something that the Harper Conservatives were trying to impose upon, just a sham, terrible act. So the 2019 election really was evidence that the Liberals were failing. And so not much has changed. The Liberals still haven't cured the issue of boil water advisories, although they have fixed it on approximately 2/3 of the ones that started when Stephen Harper was in office. By the way, the reason why we have boil water advisories is because of the Liberals, because of Paul Martin, and because of Paul Martin's cutting of funding or capping of funding on First Nations infrastructure to the 2% cap, going all the way back to the 90s and the Chrétien government. So I reiterate what I said before, which is that no Canadian political party is really invested and interested or engaged on the issues of Indigenous communities and First Nations, particularly poverty. And so, that's just a baseline. So we know that there is no party that will serve our interests, and no party represents Indigenous peoples. There are First Nations or Inuit or Métis people who get elected to office, but they're elected by Canadians. And so therefore they're going to serve Canadian interests and maybe the occasional Indigenous interest. But they can't get that forward in a party where Canadians are the dominant conversation. Canadians are who's going to elect them and re-elect them. And the fact is, and this is not a glass half full way of seeing it. This is the ultimate truth. It's not pessimistic. This is that no Canadian political party is invested in Indigenous people. They're going to be invested in Canadians, which means that Canadians' continual occupation on Indigenous territories, Canadians' use of Indigenous resources, Canada's status quo politics when it comes to keeping the situation of poverty, the situation of control, the fact that the Crown claims the land, even if it's illegal, Canadians still have that as their vested, center core of who they are as a being. So that's not really a glass half full way of seeing it. It's just the truth that's what Canadian politics involves. And the sooner that we can recognize that, then we can say, okay, if we're going to operate in this system, what I often say is it's never a question of who to vote for Indigenous peoples. It shouldn't vote at all. Because when you wrote this for Maclean's, also, people like Russ Diabo have also said this, do you vote for your oppressor? And when you accept the system that oppresses you by participating in voting for it, then are you ultimately the architect of your own demise, meaning the architect of your own control? It's like, can you imagine if we all got to vote for the Indian agents in our communities? The fact that the idea would be, yes, we get a say in who oppresses us, but we are still in a system of oppression. Right. So that's the problem here, is that that's what Canadian politics offers to Indigenous peoples. And while some Indigenous peoples, and I don't want to insult them, some Indigenous leaders, a lot of them here in Manitoba, they see that as, well, I want to get as much done as possible as I can. And I have to acknowledge, of course, my father is probably in that boat. Actually, I can tell you that my father is in that boat, not because he wants oppression, but because my father thinks we need to get some work done. We need to get some movement. We can't just pretend like the colonizer or the oppression is going away and we're going to somehow operate. We need to get as much done as possible, save as many lives as possible. We want to make sure that people get fed. And then maybe at the same time, we can resist and fight and eventually overcome the system. It's like the long game approach. We're going to get some work done today, and eventually we'll be able to overthrow the system. I think that may at times be an optimistic picture, because I think the system does very effective work in ensuring that the system continues. No matter how many times we participate, we could be like, our grandchildren will overthrow the system, but that's putting a lot on our grandchildren. And second is, it's really believing that the system will somehow weaken over time when it in fact strengthens. Yeah.
And, it's a hard place for all of us to be. How are we, what's the right way to manage the genocide machine that is Canada, and the political system and the status quo that's literally ironclad? We don't have an army behind us to even engage in that sense. And I've heard some Native people refer to voting not so much in the positive way that some people think about it, but more in terms of harm reduction. So none of these parties are going to do it for me, but who would be the worst case scenario that would just make our job 10 times harder trying to resist? And so, with that kind of harm reduction mentality, a lot of Native people vote against, Harper, for example, or will vote against Aaron O'Toole because they know what that package brings with them. Not necessarily that, Trudeau's perfect or Jagmeet Singh is perfect, but it's like, harm reduction. Who will do the least amount of harm that gives us at least a little breathing room to continue to advocate?
I'll tell you the one thing that I don't appreciate and that I don't ever support. I don't support our people calling other people who decide to vote sellouts.
Yeah, me neither.
And I think I see that far too much on Twitter.
Yeah.
The Twitter crew who decide that their way is the only way.
Exactly.
And the fact is, that is the most colonized way to operate. The most colonized way to operate is to say, our communities can't make decisions. Like, what does colonization say? Our communities can't make decisions. Indigenous peoples are too weak and deficient, and ultimately that we are that we can't make decisions for ourselves. That we need to be controlled. Well, that is exactly what people are doing on Twitter when they say this Indigenous person who has made this decision to work with the government is a sellout, can't make a decision for themselves, and ultimately we need to eradicate them from our community. I think that's very privileged. I also think that's a big extreme position that says that that completely neglects the fact that many people on Twitter, the reason why you're able to speak on Twitter is because of the work of those people who worked with the system over time to make sure that you could get an education, that makes sure that you could have some treaty rights, that to get to the position in which you are today. It's very thankless. And it also, I don't think it's very respectful to what our traditions ultimately talk about, which is that we need to work together, and we need to work together in such a way that we got to find some way to bridge this. And so we got to find a way in which, like people like to say, there was such a thing as banishment in our communities. Well, banishment didn't mean they didn't operate in the world. Like, they still existed. So like, eventually you got to deal with them. So like, the fact is that we can say all day that, you know, this person is a sellout or this person works with the government, or I think there are really remarkable Indigenous peoples that have made decisions